Hola, buongiorno, danastelin, bonjour, dobrida. Hello everyone. Welcome to this lecture on language. Those are just a few of the ones I was able to find and pronounce. This is going to be a short lecture, so don't worry. The last one was pretty long. I want to talk about language because language and thinking go hand in hand, and we'll talk about that a little more when we get to the end of this lecture. Think about how dependent we are on language. We can read a book, and by virtue of reading words, we can hear about things we'll never see. We can understand phenomena we've never experienced. We can connect via text or email or letter to people far, far away. We can coordinate with other people to make plans and carry them out. We can understand to a degree what another person is thinking as they explain it to it. Language is one of those things that is a great and amazing blessing, and we just take it for granted. I'm really grateful for language because so much information, and I love to learn about new things, is storable by virtue of language. Not only reading, but hearing and understanding. Language is quite a spectacular thing. Now, you may not have thought about it too much, but we can divide language up into phonemes. Phonemes are the sounds that make up a language. Clearly, this is what we're talking about here is spoken language. So ma, k, p, t, v. These are all phonemes that we use in English. English has about 40 phonemes. But if you combined all the languages in the world and took every single different sound made by all those languages, there's something like 869, I think it is, different sounds made in different languages. So clearly some languages have fewer than English does in the 20s, and some languages have up in the 60s and 70s. But it's the sound we make when we speak language. When we take those sounds and we combine them into units of meaning, so when I take b, oi, and put it together for boy, or when I take su, pra, ca, la, fra, j, listic, expialidocious. I don't even know. Supercalifragilisticexpialidocious. Who knows what that means? I just remember that in a song. But morphemes are simply units of sound, sounds put together to create units of meaning. And some are short, like the word I, as in I'm going home, and some are quite long. Now, the way we use morphemes is called grammar. And grammar is the rules that each language has for using words. It also includes the semantics, the syntax, the definitions, the connotations, all of the stuff that goes into making language what it is. I'm sure some of you listening to me speak more than one language. I'm sure plenty of you listening to me have gone to a new place, even just on vacation, and heard language. Learning a new language is very difficult because we can study it in a book and practice it, but actually using it with people every day has all kinds of things that grammatical rules, semantic differences in terms of how you use a word. If you think about the word matter, when we think of matter, we tend to think of the material world. Isn't it interesting that the word matter completely changes its meaning when we say to someone, "Hey, what's the matter with you?" Or this really matters to me. In that sense, the word matter goes from being the material world to the meaning of things. So the same word, depending on how we phrase it, use it, can actually mean very, very different things. Language is quite phenomenal and amazing. The process that we go through, mostly as children, in learning language is spectacular. So between the ages of age 2 and age 18, you and I learn 10 new words on average a day. And not just all the A words, but all kinds of other words. We are, and children are, amazing processors of language and storing new words to be used. Children pick up grammar by basically listening to language, and in fact, children know grammar before they know the simplest mathematical skills and ability. And if you've ever been around small children, and some of you were parents, most kids can recall words and meanings and put words into sentences, and they seem to absorb the social rules for speaking and listening, using correct words. Clearly, if you're a parent or a teacher and you have children, as I did when my children were younger, we do a lot of teaching how to use language and words on the fly. But children are also observing and absorbing, how's that for 2 words? Language, and because they're watching how other people use it, what it means, the responses they get, and clearly something mysterious is going on. If we were to look at language, by the way, and this relates not only to spoken language but also to deaf children speaking American Sign Language, we know that there's a clear delineation. So in the early months after we're born, we engage in what's called receptive language. In other words, we're beginning to associate sounds with the words, sounds with the movements that lips make, and recognizing that certain sounds seem to go with certain words, certain meanings. From 4 months on, we start using productive language. In other words, instead of just receiving, we start producing it, and this begins with babbling. Even deaf children babble with American Sign Language. They move their hands in repetitive ways. So that's productive language, and very quickly, those of you that are parents know that children discover that if I can say something, I can get a result. Babbling starts again about 10 months, and it's just a repetitive kind of sound, and it's practicing, but it's not until about 1 year of age that children start to use one word. We call them one-word sentences, like mine, more, me, food, money. In other words, we learn that certain sounds convey meaning, and when we say them, we expect a result. Then between about a year and a half to 2 years, we start to put 2-word sentences together. See bird, go home, and so on and so forth. And indeed, initially words tend to be either a verb or a noun, but with 2-word sentences or 2-word speech, essentially, often we put a verb with a noun together. And then after about 2 years of age, we start to add in complexity. So 3-word sentences, and then 4-word sentences, and so on and so forth, and gradually beginning absorbing the complex process that grammar takes. What's the order of how you say something? I'm sure all of us have had the experience of listening to someone who grew up speaking one language and they're trying to learn another one, and they're regularly changing the order because in their original language the order is different. It's quite amazing, and of course you will read more about this in your textbook. We do want to point out that there's a nature-nurture kind of combination with language. There is a very interesting psychologist, linguist named Noam Chomsky, and he has come up with the concept of something he called the LAD, or the language acquisition device, in which he basically says that every baby born everywhere in the world has the capacity to learn and speak any language. So for instance, I mentioned before that there are 869 phonemes. Every baby apparently can make every single sound perfectly in every language, or has the capacity to. Clearly they don't, because they're not exposed to the language. So what happens with the language acquisition device is every baby has it, but as we're exposed to 1 or 2 or 3 languages, first of all prenatally and then as infants, our brain wires up using those languages, and we lose the ability to ever speak perfectly native in certain languages. For those of you that learned a language a little later in life, you know that there's always going to be some accent that you have in speaking that language. And Chomsky's theory is that that's because the language acquisition device is gradually lost without exposure to a language, without hearing it every single day. I have a colleague I used to work with from Brazil, and her husband was from the United States, and she was a cognitive psychologist and knew quite a lot about language. Now she was almost perfectly fluent in English and Portuguese, and she also spoke Spanish, but she decided that she and her husband were going to speak English. He spoke English and she spoke Portuguese. They spoke to each other even before their children were born. And after their children were born, she always spoke Portuguese to the children and he always spoke English. And they had 3 children by the time I got to know them. She was actually pregnant for the last 2 when I got to know them. But when you would watch them together as a family, it was quite interesting. Their children were perfectly fluent in Portuguese and English. But whenever they talked to their dad, they would talk English, and whenever they talked to their mom, they would talk Portuguese. And even if their mom and dad were in the room, they would switch back and forth between languages. Now, she did that because she wanted to have her kids perfectly fluent, but also to have the capacity to think in each language, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes here. Clearly, our experience is going to shape our language ability, our exposure to hearing language. Not only our exposure, but our opportunities to practice, to get teaching and training and experience. And so we really have, with language, a classic nature and nurture kind of combination in a way that we can't really separate out. Now, I do have to point out that Noam Chomsky's language acquisition device theory is still a matter of debate. It's not settled. But we absolutely know that as human beings, we come predisposed, ready to learn language. And indeed, we know even newborn infants respond to the sound of their mother's voice. And if I could just point out something that is quite interesting, that even newborn babies crying, they tend to cry in the cadence of the language that they've been listening to throughout their prenatal period. So if to just give you an example between 2 languages, if you look at French and German, French is a language which tends to go up. It's a sing-songy language in that it tends to end phrases on the kind of an upward beat, where German tends to go down. Well, when you take a spectrograph analysis machine, which is a machine which measures sound, and you analyze the cries of German versus French babies, it's quite spectacular. French babies tend to cry in an upward pattern and end, and German babies tend to cry down. So we already know that the brain is wiring up even before we're born in terms of the language we're exposed to. There are critical periods with regard to language, and again, we've already talked about this, that if you don't have exposure to a language prior to a certain age, so we simply know that up to about age 2.5 to 3, that we again have amazing capacities, if we're exposed to a language, to be able to grasp it and be fluent. But starting at about age 3 to 4, and of course going into our adult years, we slowly lose the ability to perfectly master a second or third or fourth language, at least in terms of speaking. There are people clearly that can learn to read another language almost perfectly, and there seems to be no limit with that with some people. But the first 3 years of life tends to be a critical period for perfectly grasping a language, at least speaking, and let me just add further, thinking in a language. Again, those of you that are bilingual, you know this better than those of us that are just plain old Americans, that having two languages, particularly two different languages, and again, with apologies to some of you, English and Spanish are relatively close languages. But if you take a language, for instance, like Korean, or Japanese and English, or German, those languages are so different that bilingual people report that they even kind of think differently when they're using one language as opposed to other. And there's a fair amount of research to illustrate that. The study of language certainly has been greatly enhanced by our study of the brain. So the way this research works is you hook up people to some device, an fMRI machine, or any number of other machines to look at the brain, and then actually look at what happens when people use language. It is quite interesting. But there are two areas of the brain that are particularly important in the process of language, from reading to expressing it. And both of these show up in an impairment that is relatively rare, called aphasia. So one of my good friends has a cousin, and her cousin is married to a woman who has a degenerative brain disorder involving aphasia, and it's a very, very sad thing to watch. But she's losing her ability to express in words what she's thinking. And whenever I've been around her and watched as she tries to express what she's thinking, it's so frustrating, because she'll start a thought and gradually lose the ability to put that thought into words. So the first area is Broca's area, and you can see that it's in the left temporal lobe, right above your ears. On the left, and damage to the Broca's area is exactly what this woman is experiencing. It simply is a difficulty in making my lips and my tongue put words together in sentences and to speak them. So with aphasia, the theory goes, people can think, but they just can't express what they're thinking into words. Another area is called Wernicke's area, and it's in the left temporal lobe as well, just a little under Broca's area. And damage to this area kind of leads to the opposite. It leads to a difficulty in comprehending people's speech. In other words, in processing the words that people are saying. So people with damage in Wernicke's area can speak, but they can't understand. In Broca's area, they can understand perfectly well what you're saying. They just can't express it. So brain research has given us a lot of insight into what's going on with language. So I love this illustration because it's quite an amazing, complicated process that we go through that you and I take for granted every day. So let's say I'm reading a book. So if you look at number one there, the visual cortex, obviously when I'm reading, I'm looking at the words, and so my eyes pick up the information, my rods and cones at the back of my eyes, and send it through the occipital the occipital nerve to the brain, and it goes to the visual cortex. And then number two, you can see here is what's called the angular gyrus. That transmits those or transforms those visual representations into a kind of an auditory code. And then it goes to the Wernicke's area, which interprets that auditory code, and then the Broca's area, which allows me to move my muscles and speech or controls, and then I can actually move my mouth and read. So just reading a word, you can see how 5 different areas of the brain get involved. And indeed, you and I can read very, very quickly, and not only read, but understand what we're reading as we read out loud. It's quite an amazing process. And again, if we looked at it, gets way, way more complicated than this, but just reading a word or 3 words or a sentence, your brain is all involved. Now, the second thing I want to talk about here is just how does thinking relate to language? Like how and does language affect and maybe even shape the way we think? And again, how does our thinking process go in the opposite direction and shape our use of language? And again, a third question, which I won't really take up today, but can we think without using language? In other words, surely we think in images without language. And the answer to that is yes, but it's such a complicated process, and I wanted to keep this lecture short that I'll skip that. We absolutely know that language affects thought, and this theory or this area of language or psycholinguistics is called linguistic determinism, and it's this idea that language is almost the software of our brain, and once we learn a particular language, it sets certain limits, like software sets certain limits on how the hardware can function. So that if you speak or learn one language or have been exposed to one language, your thinking processes are going to be a little bit different than if you were exposed or grew up speaking another language. So linguistic determinism is basically this idea, and this idea is also called Whorf's hypothesis because it's named after Benjamin Whorf. And he studied a Native American group called the Hopi, who just don't have past tenses in their language. And so as he studied them, it was hard for them to grasp what's so easy for us to grasp in Spanish or English or whatever language you speak, because we do have past tenses for what happened in the past. Well, the Hopi, because they were exposed to language, and the Hopi language does not have a past tense, it was much harder for them to talk about what you and I take for granted, namely the past, yesterday, 3 weeks ago, 4 weeks ago. Whorf developed this hypothesis and expanded it, and plenty of others have come along and tested it. And indeed, this linguistic determinism would simply say that our language is going to shape how we think. So to give you another famous example, when I look at snow, as a person exposed to a couple languages in Africa and English and German and French and Spanish and maybe 1 or 2 others, but certainly I can't speak all those perfectly, but these are all languages in which there's 1 word or maybe 2 words for snow, maybe sleet. And so when I see snow or when I perceive snow and think about snow, I do it in a very different way, for instance, than Eskimo, certain Eskimo languages, in which there are 30 or 35 or 40 words for snow. And indeed, the idea here is that a person that grew up and experienced 35 different words for snow thinks about snow, perceives snow very differently than you or I. And for us, it's simplistic. It's white stuff that falls from the sky when it's cold. Now, I may add certain descriptive words to my snow. It's fluffy snow, it's wet snow, and so on and so forth. But this is the idea behind linguistic determinism, and it's quite fascinating if you think about it. Just to give you some example here. Okay, so let's look at that first question. Does language shape emotions or reflect them? Well, Japanese is a fascinating language, and Japanese is a language which has way more words for emotions, personal emotions. And again, we have the words for sympathy and empathy, but Japanese has 8, 10, 12 nuances in those words. And again, in English, we even have difficulty differentiating between sympathy and empathy. Again, sympathy, as far as I know, would be that, I feel bad for you. Empathy would be I enter into the experience of the emotion, or try to, that you're having. Do languages shape personality differences? Well, those of you that are bilingual, and plenty of research shows that if you give someone a personality test in one language as opposed to another, very often their actual personality profile is different. So those of you that are bilingual, you probably get this better than the rest of us. It's almost like you have a different personality, a Spanish personality, an English personality, or a Korean personality, or a Creole personality, or whatever other languages you speak. I love this Czech proverb, learn a new language and get a new soul. I remember talking to a Japanese person who told me, and I didn't understand at the time, later on when I studied a little bit more, I spent a summer in Japan, and he said to me, I became an individual when I started to study English. And I was looking at him like, what? Nihongo ga wakarimasen. I don't understand Japanese. But because Japanese as a culture is a Confucian culture, and because Confucian culture puts so much emphasis upon family and not individualism, but you as a part of a family, as a part of a group, as a part of a culture, a very collectivistic understanding, as opposed to, as Americans, it's all about the individual. Japanese as a language is set up to diminish kind of these interpersonal or personality distinctions, and to indeed enhance the notion of us as a part of a group, or color perception. I won't go into that, but clearly the way we perceive color has been shown to change from language to language to language. This just absolutely fascinates me, because I wonder often the extent to which our exposure to language really shapes how we view the world. And I've even thought to myself that maybe some of our cultural differences, our political differences as we read the news every day, may be a function of language. Here's another good example. Clearly, some languages have masculine and feminine aspects to them. Certainly Spanish and French are good examples, Italian good examples of every noun, again, is either masculine and feminine. And, once you learn a language, you don't even think about that. And if someone tried to say it differently, if they tried to use le or as opposed to la in French, it just doesn't sound right. And we're not even really thinking. But there were reasons why some of those are masculine as opposed to feminine. And that may shape how we see the world. Even when we, for instance, in English, when we read books written 50, 100 years ago, pretty much the masculine pronouns dominate. A great example that you see in front of you is this notion of mankind, which means, all of us, humanity. But by virtue of the language using the masculine for things that represent us all, that certainly may at least have something to say about how we think about ourselves, how we understand, how we speak to each other. It's just one example of understanding things. Now, those of you that are bilingual, congratulations, because the psychological research shows that you have a huge advantage, that if you're bilingual or trilingual or quadrilingual, again, you have numerous more brain connections and neural networks, particularly if you are bi or trilingual from a very, very early age. In other words, the web of neural connections in your brain is much denser, much thicker, and that would simply, that's what you want. Everybody wants a brain with multiple dendritic connections, and languages, because they're they're the software of our hardware of our brain, are going to enhance that. And indeed, if you have a computer with 6 or 7, programs, how much more effective is that same computer than if you just have one program? So clearly, bilingual and trilingualism is quite impressive, and we do know that children that are bi or trilingual may have less vocabulary in each language than person that's monolingual. Because think about it, if you're bilingual, you have twice as many words to learn. And so even if you know less words in each language, the total number of words that you know is going to be much, much more. And all of the things that go along with thinking, that perhaps if you listen to one of the earlier lectures on thinking, every single thing we talked about thinking is going to be impacted and affected by languages. If I could end with a story. Years ago, I was on an island. I went down there with a group on a missions, a short-term missions group, and the people that were our guides for the several weeks we were there were Americans, but their kids were born in Bonaire. Bonaire is part of the Netherlands Antilles, and that also includes Aruba and Curacao. But the Netherlands Antilles is right off the coast of Venezuela. Now, I remember sitting at their house one day, and so 2 Americans, they were the husband and wife, they were talking to each other in English. Their children, who were about 10 or 11 years old, maybe younger, maybe older, they were in the living room and they were watching Spanish TV because the TV came from Venezuela. They were doing homework in Dutch in front of the Spanish TV because the schools are all in Dutch. Their friend from next door was there, and their friend from next door was from Brazil. And so they were watching TV in Spanish, doing their homework in Dutch with their friend, and speaking Portuguese to him. And when their parents would ask them questions in English, they would respond to their parents in perfect English. It was the perfect way. And they actually had a 5th language. There's a local language called Papiamentu, which is a combination. It's kind of like Creole, which is kind of like French, but has other things to it. But these kids spoke perfectly in 3 or 4 languages. I don't know how well their accent was in Portuguese, but and it was just an amazing thing to watch. And so those of you that are bilingual, when and if you have children, do everything you can to expose your children to as many languages as they can, particularly hearing it every day, because it'll be hugely beneficial for them. Well, thank you for listening. Have a good day, and we'll see you in the next lecture.